and welcome to another episode of SaaS Showdown. My name is Colin McCarthy, and I'm very happy that you've joined us today for another conversation with my colleague and friend.
And I'm Rose Layton. Thanks, Colin. So today I was thinking, we've talked about SaaS and we've talked about SaaS Apps and we've talked about how to purchase SaaS and the general market of SaaS companies. So today I was thinking maybe we would transition a little bit over into managing SaaS. We have all of these SaaS tools in our buckets as IT people. What do we do with them?
Right, yes, because once you've got all of those separate applications, they, as you've said, they need to be managed, secured, and discover. You need to discover what you have, what is being used, to run some audits on them, etc. Manage the licensing and the costs. So, I know me personally, when in our journey and continued adoption into SaaS-based applications, it was always around managing the account, managing the identity. Mm-hmm. And then, it grew from there. So for us, I think the most important part is defining that part of the identity that you're going to be managing.
Right, because it's not just one account anymore, right? It's not an email account with this password that you use everywhere. Usually, you've got your Googles, your project managers, your Slacks, your Zooms, all with different logins.
Right, yes. And when we previously spoke about how to choose a SaaS application, obviously we spoke about single sign-on, whether it was Saml or Google OAuth. So there is essentially only one account to rule them all. And all of your SaaS applications connect in through some means. Whether you're on, Google Workspace and it's added into the marketplace, or you're in Azure AD, Azure Identity. So I guess that really brings us up the point of how do you manage that identity and identity access management.
Right. IAM.
Right.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but every organization that's older than maybe 20 years or so started on Active Directory.
Oh,
right?
Yes.
That's how they started managing identities.
Well, yeah, it was so simple because
it's the only game in town too.
Yeah. You would log onto your computer. You couldn't do anything on your computer than what your administrator wanted you to do, and that AD account obviously would give you access to resources, file servers, etc. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those days are historic.
I remember the first time I ever saw it. I thought it was magic, right? Being able to log in on any computer in the network.
Yeah, roaming profiles.
Yeah.
Putting limits on how much people could store to the desktop so that they didn't have huge roaming profiles and was never able to log in from one computer to another because it would take too long to download everything you put on the desktop.
I remember we had things. Like H files or J files or whatever that were like our personal. That's where you put your stuff if you wanted to keep it.
It was all about mapping that home directory in the Active Directory profile. So those, that is the traditional identity, but obviously Active Directory is being retired in a lot of places. We were talking to a friend and colleague recently who's looking to get rid of their on-premise Active Directory and use another service as the identity.
Why are they looking to get rid of their Active Directory? Like, what starts that?
I think for him and for a lot of others, and for ourselves even, in my experience, it's the lack of physical on-premise services that people are connecting to. Mm-hmm. People don't have file servers. People shouldn't be connecting, authenticating to a VPN to get access to a resource. Everything is being access through the browser from anywhere on any device. So therefore,
what's the point?
Yeah, what's the point of having an Active Directory? It's just too restrictive, and for companies to try and manage it, manage certainly in the last 15, 16 months with everybody being remote and not in corporate offices, securing your devices through a group policy when nobody connects to the network is incredibly difficult. AD worked for a bygone era that is no longer with us. So, but that carries on. There's an hours of conversation about that and all the developments there. But choosing that identity is often the starting point, because pivoting off Active Directory, it can be done. I think you did it, or your organization has done that.
My company did it shortly before I arrived, actually, 4.5 years ago. And I think there's just a lot of factors to consider when you go off of Active Directory, because many places are not only using Active Directory to give access to network resources, they're also using it to manage the hardware that they're giving to their employees, right? Laptops, or in some cases, desktops. And sometimes, depending on what they have, right? If they have Microsoft, Active Directory is intricately connected to how you use Microsoft products. So,
certainly if you were on a traditional Exchange environment, which, obviously a lot of people were, certainly before Gmail as a service, or, Google Apps for Business came around, everybody was using on-premise Exchange, and your AD account would give you access to that mailbox. Right. But it's interesting how you've said about how obviously that identity is also linked to how the device is managed and secured. And it's interesting that the choice of your identity access, choice can be dependent on the collaboration platforms you're on, and also the type of hardware that you use.
Both of them together, which it's not normally something we think of as inextricably linked, but in this case, they have to go together.
They certainly have to be considered in the discussion and the conversation. It's almost like a matrix can be created. If you have this and you have that, then this is the best combination of services for you. It's picked from one of these columns, and what meets up in the middle is the best solution for you.
And when it comes to identity and access management, you don't have to go with just one thing, right? You can marry hardware solutions with software ones.
Yes. Yeah. And there's some organizations that will, for their requirement and their need, have potentially 2 AIM providers. You could be utilizing Azure Active Directory and also Okta.
Right.
Or I know
we used Jump Cloud and Okta for a while, because we had the need for it.
Yeah. And a conversation about all the pros and cons of that would be incredibly technical.
Yes, for sure.
And potentially rather boring and quite niche. But, each one of them has limitations. Like Google Cloud has a sync tool into Active Directory, but it can only sync one domain. Okta has more capability to sync multiple domains in. So, there are some corporations that have multiple domains that end up having, all 3 purely because they don't all play
has
well.
Some very deep, customization options. So not just branding, but also custom profile fields and things like that. So they are really deep into that if you have a need for it.
Right. Yes. And there's also the integration into, other applications and using it as the identity provider for all of your other applications that you have, whether it's, Zoom or your help desk ticketing system, your expense program, everything you single sign on into. So,
so what's the goal? for the end user experience when you're looking at identity and access management? What's the goal?
In the realm of SaaS management and choosing an AIM, simplicity. I very much believe in frictionless IT for the end user. It needs to be, it needs to be, it needs to be frictionless and not a problem.
Right.
It can't be frustrating to use, because otherwise they'll find ways around it, or they won't use the corporate products and they'll start using a lot of shadow IT because
I think it also has to be easy to find, right? Like, you don't want your users getting lost. That's why I think things like Okta and OneLogin and places like that, right? They have basically apps pages for your users.
Right.
They just click on whichever app they're trying to use right now, and it will take them and log them into it.
Yeah. And, the Google Cloud Identity has that with the Google dashboard. You can log in and you can see all the SaaS applications that have been published to you. And even Azure AD, your Microsoft account, you could sign into a dashboard and see all of the single sign-on applications. So they all have very, very competitive, comparable features like that. But yes, I think the choice does revolve around, I'm going to say it does depend on the hardware that's being used as well, and the type of industry. I know that a lot of people, if they are a Mac shop, then there's some more flexibility. Everybody really has to use Jamf. There are
if you're a full Mac shop,
there are other obviously Mac-based administration programs they can use. But if you're using Jamf to manage your device, then your identity you have a lot more flexibility with. Although there are some pros and cons of using each one depending on how the secure login is done on the Mac and password writebacks. If you're primarily a Windows 10 shop, then obviously, Azure AD, Intune is that easier road to go down regarding choosing your AIM platform.
And what about us poor souls who have mixed OS shops?
So yes, that is why there are.
I would say that's why the Oktas and the Jump Clouds and the Google Cloud exist, right? Because companies these days have a really hard time justifying 100% Windows or 100% Mac, especially as they get larger.
Yes, because there is more flexibility I'm finding is being required by employees, and in some markets it's a very competitive field. So companies have made that educated choice a number of years ago to provide hardware that the end users want to work with. I am never going to go and work for a company where I have to use Outlook again. That will be my choice. So I would only ever. I don't mind which OS I use, whether it's Windows or a Chromebook, but some people are more picky with what they want to use.
Well, and for some particular fields as well, like we know software development mostly takes place on Macs. There's a lot of video production that mostly takes place on Mac. Finance and accounting organizations tend to be fairly Windows heavy.
Yep.
So there's some field preferences there based on what industry you're in and things like that. But or you could be like my organization, right? We're about 30% Chromebooks, 30% Mac, and 40% Windows, I think, at this point. So we just have all the things.
Yes, which means you end up having. We want
them to be managed the same, right? We want them to be managed fairly collectively together.
When you say the same, are you talking within the same application, that single pane of glass?
Yes, in some ways, yes. But also I'm talking about, we want them to connect to the same identity. We want somebody to be able to, if they decide that they want to switch to Mac for their next computer, right? It's not a big deal for us to transition them. They're connected to the same systems at the top. Right.
So you don't want...
They have the same software installed at the start, right? They can work with the same imaging or MDM or whatever that we're using to secure both.
Yeah. You don't want your Chromebook users to be on a Google identity and your Mac users to be on an Okta identity, because then it makes it just harder for, as you say, any end user transitions or help desk support tickets, knowing which identity to try and manage. It's interesting how we were talking about, I guess our initial overview of the three different areas, manage, secure, discover, and talking about how to manage the identity, but we've sort of pivoted to hardware for the last 4 minutes.
Which, I know. I think is interesting because
but this is great because SaaS, everybody thinks of SaaS as and zero trust as managing the identity
and data.
And data. So, that's the manage of their data, secure, their documents and the sharing and the discovering any applications that they're using. But in a corporation that's providing end user hardware, the ability to how you manage that, I think, does play a very important part in that AIM decision. I think if you're a corporation, and I don't know of any large ones, it's generally startups that won't give you a company computer. They might give you, an expense account to purchase one or maintain one, but
they're bring your own device companies.
Yeah. However many, serious BYOD, policy and companies there are, and then you are just solely managing that identity.
Well, and you're not, though, in a way, because even bring your own device companies have management.
MDM. Yes. Yeah.
It's one of the pitfalls. Well, you hope that they do. They don't always, especially in the startup world, but you would hope that they do.
Right. Yes. So
like some antivirus or something.
So AIM, that the program you use, whether it's something like Okta, Jump Cloud, Azure AD, Wide Login, or Google Cloud Identity, your Google account, it isn't solely about the identity. As we've said, it's about that choice of how you're managing the device. And it's not just, as you've very well highlighted and pointed out, it's not just corporate devices, but your BYOD policy would have a mobile device management policy and application attached to that. And I know that Okta has an app. I think Azure AD has an app. Cloud Identity certainly has a policy to manage that data. I don't know about Jump Cloud and OneLogin.
I don't either. No, I use Jump Cloud mostly in the browser. But well, so pivoting back a little bit to the software piece, I think the one thing when you start looking at identity and access management, even if you had Active Directory before, right, you probably have unmanaged SaaS applications that aren't being logged into with anything, or they're being logged into with OAuth accounts, Google, Microsoft, Facebook sometimes. But one of the first things I think, and I know, Colin, this is one of your favorite pain points, that you realize when you try to bring all of those apps in under one identity is how much Saml costs. Right.
Yes. Which we mentioned how do we choose a SaaS application and the pain points of that.
And some apps don't even have Saml. It's not even something that they offer. So what do we do in these cases?
I'm trying to think. I don't know. I haven't come across any, third-party SaaS application that would be added on to your primary collaboration tools, Google Workspace and Office 365, that doesn't provide some form of SAML authentication. But it might not be the SAML. but it might they might not, but it might not be this. They might not work with the identity provider that you have chosen.
You want. Yeah.
So and that can be a deciding factor over which identity provider you decide to go with. So,
or sometimes whether or not you renew your contract with that other piece of software.
Right. Yes, because obviously whatever piece of software they have, there's probably a few competitors.
Right. So like, for instance, we have a contract management tool at the organization I currently work for. Will not name it, but I don't want to throw them too far under the bus. But they don't do SAML. I think we asked for it, and they offered upwards of several $1,000s to put it into place. So we just decided no. But now that means that this piece of software is siloed, right? It's off to the side compared to the rest of our core applications. I wouldn't consider this a core application. It's used by a very small subset of people, mostly lawyers. And people who do deal with contracts at the organization. And so it's not core. I wouldn't have considered it a deal breaker for our identity and access management tool, right? I would have been like, oh, you don't integrate with such and such. Guess it's a no-go because they don't integrate with anything.
And I guess it becomes a problem of if every user needed to use that piece of software, then it would be unmanageable. But as you've explained, only certain members of the company need that software, so it's kind of manageable. That application doesn't have single sign-on, is just a separate siloed username and password. It's not brilliant, and you then have to think to know, okay, out of the, let's say a number, out of the 2,000 people in our organization, 20 of those people have a separate username and password for this siloed application. Out of those 2,000 people, if one of those 20 people need leave, then the IT team needs to do their normal deprovision, but then remember, these are one of the 20 people that have this other thing. So that's where AIM, and SaaS management really wins. And having those siloed applications and not having a single sign-on obviously is where problems happen because,
And for what it's worth, I mean, we've changed a number of applications in my current organization because they didn't work with identity and access management. They just, it's too much friction, right? Yes. Either it worked, but it didn't work properly all the time, or it didn't work at all, or they were going to charge us an exorbitant amount of money for it, or what have you. And I say that mostly so that the listeners don't feel bad about those decisions, but also we push our vendors, right? We push on them and say, this is something that we have to have because this is a good experience for our employees, and it's a good experience for our security team, and it's a good experience for IT, right? And so most of them will come down, right? They'll either lower prices or they will build the thing that didn't exist, right? Some of them, not all of them, but many of them will. And so you can't be afraid to negotiate on those things, especially if you're really trying hard to transition away from the old way, right? From Active Directory, on-premise networks, things like that.
Yeah. So, in as we get to the end of our a normal allotted time for these discussions, I think coming in, in the final thoughts, it's about having that courage to make that change, to get away from your physical Active Directory. Yes, it can be difficult to pivot from one identity to another, but it can be done. It has been done. And, to have courage and the commitment to move away from applications that you're using that don't provide the access and security features that you need, because it is a competitive market and there are a lot more competitors out there. And while it is a big project and it could be problematic moving from one application to another, it's to move the business forwards, and the whole practice of SaaS ops and better SaaS management. I think it's something that everybody should be doing.
It feels like one of the very first big steps.
Yeah.
And let me just say, I know we've talked about a lot about the problems associated with switching IAM providers, choosing IAM providers. When you get it set up, when you're through the project, it's magic.
Yes, it is. Yes, life will become a lot more simple and a lot more streamlined, and that simplification and how to streamline and automate a lot of stuff will be covered in future episodes of the SaaS Showdown. So thank you very much, Rose, for joining me again for another
Thanks, Colin.
another conversation. Thank you.
Produced by the Tab Geeks Network. Enjoy all of our shows on YouTube at youtube.com/tabgeeks. Join our exclusive, free, no sponsors allowed Slack community and sign up for our newsletter at tabgeeks.com.